The Nazis had spent years inflicting terror and death on thousands of people. But when American soldiers finally reached Dachau, the tables turned in an instant. Captured SS guards faced the fury of those they had tormented, and what followed became one of the most shocking and controversial moments of the war's final days. Dachau did not begin as a death camp, and that is what makes its story so disturbing. It opened on March 22, 1933, only 7 weeks after Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. The camp was built on the site of an abandoned munitions factory near the small town of Dachau, just outside Munich. The location was not hidden. From the very beginning, Dachau was designed to send a message to the German public. Speak out. And this is where you end up. At first, it was only about fear. The early prisoners were German citizens who opposed the Nazi Party. Communists were among the first to arrive, followed by social democrats, journalists, writers, lawyers, and trade union leaders. These were educated men, community leaders, and political voices. The goal was to break them, and everyone else would fall silent. Guards beat prisoners in public. Prisoners were forced to stand for hours during roll calls. Punishment was meant to be seen and remembered. The SS quickly turned Dachau into an experiment. They tested how much food could be taken away without killing a man right away. They tested how long prisoners could be forced to stand in the cold. They tested isolation, sleep deprivation, and group punishment. If one man broke a rule, everyone suffered. Fear spread faster that way. Dachau became a place where cruelty was planned, practiced, and improved. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, paid close attention to Dachau. He saw it as a model for the future. The camp commandant and guards were trained not just to control prisoners, but to erase their dignity. Dachau became a training school for SS personnel. Guards who learned their methods there were later sent to camps like Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Auschwitz, and Treblinka. What worked in Dachau was copied again and again. By the late 1930s, the camp changed in a major way. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, when Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked across Germany, more than 10,000 Jewish men were sent to Dachau in a matter of weeks. Many were businessmen, teachers, and war veterans from World War I. They were beaten, starved, and humiliated to force their families to leave Germany. Dachau was no longer just about political enemies. It was now part of a racial war. Soon, other groups followed. Roma families were arrested and sent to the camp. Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned for refusing to swear loyalty to Hitler. Disabled men were labeled as useless and locked away. Homosexual men were targeted and abused. Catholic priests from Germany, Poland, and other occupied countries were imprisoned in large numbers, especially those who spoke against Nazi policies. Dachau had become a place where anyone the Nazis disliked could disappear. When World War II began in September 1939, Dachau expanded again. The camp added dozens of subcamps across southern Germany and Austria. Prisoners were sent out daily to work in factories producing weapons, aircraft parts, and military equipment. Others built roads, dug tunnels, and worked on construction projects tied to the war effort. The work was brutal. Guards pushed prisoners to exhaustion. Injuries were ignored. If someone collapsed, they were beaten or removed. Removal usually meant death. Prisoners who could no longer work were sent back to the main camp, where food was reduced even further. Disease spread quickly. Medical experiments were carried out on selected prisoners, including tests involving freezing, pressure chambers, and infectious illnesses. Many did not survive. Their bodies were burned or buried without records. This was the system the American soldiers would soon walk into. By the start of 1945, Nazi Germany was falling apart from every direction. The Red Army was pushing hard from the east after crossing into Poland and eastern Germany. From the west, American and British forces were moving quickly through France and into German territory. Cities were being bombed. Supply lines were broken. Communication was chaotic. Inside the SS, there was no longer any doubt that the war was lost. Still, the camp system did not stop. In many ways, it became even more brutal. As enemy armies closed in on camps in the east, the SS began emptying them. Prisoners were forced out on long marches in winter weather, often wearing thin uniforms and wooden shoes. These became known as death marches. Anyone who fell behind was beaten or shot. Thousands died on frozen roads and in forests. Those who survived were loaded onto open trucks or sealed rail cars and sent west toward Dachau, which was still operating. Trains arrived at Dachau almost daily in early 1945. Many cars were packed so tightly that prisoners could not sit down. Some had been traveling for days without food or water. When the doors were opened, guards often found dozens of bodies inside. The living were barely alive. They were dragged out, counted, and pushed into the camp. There was no space left. Barracks meant for a few hundred now held over 1,000 men. Food inside Dachau nearly disappeared. Prisoners received thin soup made mostly of water and scraps. Bread rations were cut again and again. Many prisoners went days without eating anything solid. Hunger weakened their bodies, making them easy targets for disease. Typhus spread quickly through the overcrowded barracks, carried by lice. There were not enough doctors, medicines, or beds. The camp hospital turned into a waiting room for death. The crematorium could no longer keep up with the number of dead. Bodies were stacked outside in piles, sometimes left there for days. Prisoners were forced to carry the corpses of friends and strangers alike. The smell of death hung over the camp at all times. Guards walked past bodies without reacting. For them, it had become normal. By April 1945, around 30,000 prisoners were still alive inside Dachau. Most were severely malnourished. Many weighed less than 40 kilograms. Legs were swollen from hunger. Faces were hollow. Some prisoners could no longer stand or speak. Others stared blankly, too weak to react. Hope had become dangerous. Expecting anything good only made the suffering worse. The SS guards felt the pressure closing in. Some destroyed documents that listed names and deaths. Others changed into civilian clothes, hoping to escape later. A few tried to pretend they were prisoners. At the same time, rumors spread about final orders. Some guards feared being captured. Others feared punishment from their own officers if they abandoned their posts. No one knew if the SS would flee, surrender, or kill the remaining prisoners before the Allies arrived. By April 1945, the U.S. 7th Army was moving fast through southern Germany. The war was almost over, but the fighting had not fully stopped. Roads were filled with retreating German soldiers, refugees, and destroyed vehicles. Towns surrendered one after another. American troops were advancing every day. One of the units leading the advance was the 45th Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbirds. Most of its soldiers were young men from Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Many had enlisted years earlier, never imagining the war would take them this far. They had first gone into combat during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. From there, they fought their way through Italy, southern France, and into Germany. By 1945, they had seen heavy fighting, lost close friends, and learned how quickly life could end. They were tough, but they were also worn down. Months of combat had left them tired and on edge. Nothing surprised them anymore, or so they thought. Nearby was the 42nd Infantry Division, called the Rainbow Division because it was made up of soldiers from across the United States. These men had landed in France in late 1944 and pushed east through some of the hardest fighting of the final months. They crossed rivers under fire and moved through towns where civilians hid in cellars. By April, they were exhausted and angry. They wanted the war to end, but they also knew it was still dangerous. On April 28, 1945, American units began receiving reports about a large camp near the town of Dachau. The information was vague. Some reports called it a prison. Others said it held political detainees. There was no clear picture. Many soldiers assumed it would be similar to prisoner of war camps they had already liberated, where conditions were bad, but understandable within the rules of war. The next morning, April 29th, American troops moved toward Dachau. There was very little resistance. German units were surrendering in large numbers across the region. Some SS men raised white flags as American vehicles approached. Others abandoned their posts. and disappeared into nearby woods or towns. Before the troops ever reached the main gate of Dachau, they came across a train stopped on a rail line just outside the camp. It had arrived days earlier from Buchenwald. The train had not been unloaded. It had simply been left there. Around 40 rail cars stood in a long, silent line, and their doors were still sealed. When American soldiers forced the doors open, they were hit with a sight they were not prepared for. Inside the cars were hundreds of dead prisoners. Bodies were piled on top of one another because there had been no space to lie down. Some men were naked, having torn off their clothes in confusion or desperation. Others were frozen in strange positions, as if caught mid-movement. Many had clear bullet wounds. Others had died slowly from thirst, starvation, or lack of air during the journey. The heat and decay had trapped the smell inside the cars. When the doors opened, it rushed out all at once. Soldiers gagged and turned away. Many who had survived heavy combat stood still. There was nothing to fight here, but this was only the beginning. As the soldiers moved past the train and entered Dachau, the scene became even harder to understand. Prisoners began stumbling toward them from inside the camp. Some collapsed after a few steps, their legs unable to carry them anymore. Some cried openly. Some dropped to the ground and touched the soldiers' boots as if to prove they were real. Others were too weak or too shocked to react. The Americans walked deeper into the camp and saw piles of corpses lying near the barracks. Some had been there for days. Others looked as if they had died only hours earlier. They saw men who looked like skeletons covered in skin, with sunken eyes and swollen limbs. They saw gallows used for executions. They saw whips, clubs, and guard towers, placed to watch every movement. SS guards were still inside the camp. Near the camp's coal yard, soldiers from the 45th Infantry Division gathered a group of captured guards. These men were not soldiers who had fought on the front lines. They were part of the camp staff. They had enforced rules, carried out punishments, and kept the system running until the very last hours. Lieutenant William P. Walsh was present at the coal yard, along with enlisted soldiers. Suddenly, gunfire broke out. American soldiers opened fire on the captured SS guards. There was no warning, no shouted order that could be clearly heard afterward. Several guards were hit immediately and fell where they stood. Others tried to run away across the yard, but were shot before they could get far. The entire shooting lasted only a short time. When it stopped, the ground was covered with bodies. About 17 SS guards were dead at the coal yard. Some were killed instantly, others wounded and died shortly after. The shooting was not planned. It was not ordered by higher command. It happened in a moment when anger, shock, and disbelief overwhelmed discipline. Soldiers who had been trained to follow rules reached a breaking point. The coal yard was not the only place where guards were killed that day. In other parts of the camp, smaller groups of SS men were shot. Some were killed while trying to escape, others after they had already surrendered. These incidents happened separately and without coordination. Later investigations estimated that between 35 and 50 German guards were killed in total during and shortly after the liberation of Dachau. Lieutenant Colonel Felix L. Sparks, commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 157th Infantry Regiment, arrived at the coal yard soon after the shooting. When he saw what had happened, he immediately ordered all firing to stop. He placed armed guards around the remaining prisoners and SS personnel. He made it clear that no more killings would be allowed. From that moment on, Sparks focused on restoring order, securing the camp, and protecting the thousands of prisoners who were still alive. The shootings at the coal yard did not bring calm to Dachau. The camp was still full of pain, anger, and confusion. Many prisoners had just learned they were free after years of abuse. Some recognized former guards who had beaten them, starved them, or sent friends to their deaths. For some prisoners, the shock turned into rage. They attacked guards with whatever they could find, shovels, stones, bare hands. Years of fear and silence burst out in moments. American soldiers were spread thin across the camp. There were tens of thousands of prisoners and only a limited number of troops. Some soldiers tried to stop the attacks and pull prisoners away. Others stood frozen, unsure how to react. Many had just seen the train and the bodies, their emotions still raw. Order was hard to restore in a place that had never known order, only control through chaos. At the same time, the real fight for survival began. U.S. Army doctors and medics rushed into Dachau as soon as it was secured. They found thousands of prisoners suffering from starvation, dehydration, and disease. Typhus was spreading fast. Entire barracks were quarantined to stop it from spreading further. Feeding the prisoners was dangerous. Many had not eaten properly for weeks or months. If they were given too much food too quickly, their bodies could shut down. Medics started with small portions of soup and bread, slowly increasing rations. Even with care, many prisoners were too weak to recover. Hundreds died in the days and weeks after liberation, their bodies unable to heal. Within days, word of the shootings at Dachau reached senior officers. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, was informed what had happened. Even in the final days of the war, killing surrendered prisoners was a serious matter. An investigation was ordered, but its purpose was limited. It was meant to record the facts, not to seek punishment. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph M. Whitaker was assigned to lead the inquiry. He interviewed officers and enlisted men who had been present at Dachau. He reviewed reports and timelines. His investigation confirmed that American soldiers had killed captured SS guards during and shortly after the liberation. It also described the extreme emotional strain on the troops and the horrifying conditions inside the camp. Whitaker's report was completed in June 1945. By then, Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Millions of displaced people needed help. Nazi leaders were being arrested and prepared for trial. The focus had shifted forward. No American soldiers were charged for the killings at Dachau. General Patton reviewed the report and dismissed the case. He believed the men had acted under extreme circumstances and that pursuing punishment would serve no purpose. The incident was officially closed. Dachau did not suddenly become quiet after liberation. Once the prisoners were removed and the worst medical emergencies were handled, the Americans took control of the camp and gave it a new purpose. The same fences, guard towers, and barracks that had once held victims were now used to detain SS members, camp personnel, and Nazi officials. Men who had once held power were now locked behind the same wire. Soon after, Dachau became one of the main places where the United States held war crimes trials in Germany. Between November 1945 and August 1948, U.S. military courts operated inside the former camp. These trials focused on crimes committed in Dachau itself and in other camps that had been run by the same SS personnel. Guards, doctors, commanders, and administrators were brought before the court to answer for beatings, torture, starvation, and murder. In total, 1,672 defendants were tried at Dachau. The evidence was often overwhelming. Survivor testimony, camp records, and physical proof showed how the system worked and who enforced it. Of those convicted, 426 were sentenced to death. Many others received life sentences or long prison terms. For some survivors, this was the first time they felt the world was finally listening. For the prisoners who survived Dachau, freedom did not mean an easy future. Many were too weak to travel and remained in hospitals for months. When they were able to leave, they often had nowhere to go. Families had been killed. Homes were destroyed or taken by others. Borders had changed. Some survivors became displaced persons, living in camps for years after the war ended. American soldiers eventually left Dachau and returned home. They went back to normal lives, jobs, and families. But many carried Dachau with them for the rest of their lives. They rarely spoke about it. What they had seen there stayed with them quietly, long after their uniforms were put away.